The calm before the storm is always deceptive. Berlin in the evening of 1939 sinks into a gray gloom, the streets empty as if the townspeople know that lingering too long outdoors could be a fatal mistake. In the distance, the echoes of footsteps can be heard, soldiers patrolling the city. Above the roof of one of the buildings, a streetlight flickers, casting eerie shadows on the cobblestone pavement. This is a place that is not spoken about openly. Prince Albrechtstrasse, Acht, the headquarters of the Gestapo. Here, no one screams, at least not outside. People who enter the massive metal doors rarely come out again. And even if they do, they are no longer the same as they were before. The building towers over the street, massive, cold, devoid of decorative excesses. It looms with its presence as if embodying a power that cannot be shaken. Those who pass by avoid looking up at the second-floor windows, where the light is usually on, and behind the thick curtains lie countless interrogation rooms. Inside, it's a labyrinth. Long corridors disappearing into darkness are designed to confuse. Half of the doors are false, intended only to heighten the sense of helplessness in those seeking an exit. But there is no exit. Right at the entrance is the administrator's desk. An impeccably dressed SS officer checks documents as if it were a bank or a law office. There is no trace of sympathy or emotion in his movements. On either side of him are two corridors. One leads to the interrogation rooms, the other down to the dungeons, from which few return. The prisoners are made to wait. This is the first torture. A person is seated on a hard wooden chair against a cold stone wall, left alone in an empty room. Only a thin beam of light filters through a tiny window under the ceiling, as if accidentally left as a trace of the normal world. Sometimes the door cracks open, and voices can be heard in the corridor. People speak softly, matter-of-factly, without emotion. Time passes slowly. The prisoner tries to keep track of the time, counting the seconds, but soon loses count. Watches are deliberately absent in these rooms. Disorientation is one of the first tools of breaking down. When it's finally their turn, two guards lead them into the corridor. Here, the walls are scratched with fingernails, dark stains, and the soundproofing is imperfect. Deliberately so. Far ahead, a muffled groan, a sharp scream, and then silence. Interrupted silence is the most terrifying, because the prisoner realizes that soon someone else will be in their place. Or they will. Light bulbs hang from the ceiling on long wires, each flickering, creating a sense of stale air. The prisoner walks, not knowing where they will end up, in a room for a brief interrogation or in the basement, from which there is no way back. The door at the end of the corridor opens, and they are pushed inside. On the wall hang black and white photographs, women, men, sometimes children. Some faces are crossed out with a red line, those who did not survive. The officer sitting behind a massive oak desk points to a chair with a lazy smile. He examines a file, slowly flipping through the pages. Then he looks up and asks, as if inquiring about dinner, "So what can you tell us?" The first interrogation is just the beginning. Silence is the worst enemy. In the cells of the Gestapo, it was never complete. Sometimes distant footsteps, muffled voices, someone's suppressed groan could be heard from the corridors. But in the moments when the sound disappeared altogether, consciousness began to play tricks on the person. Waiting became torture in itself. The bare concrete walls pressed in, the air was thick with the acrid smell of sweat and blood. This was not just an interrogation room. It was a place where human will was broken. There were no windows, only a thin strip of light under the door, the sole reminder of the outside world. When the door opened, 3 men entered the room. The chief interrogator, a gaunt man in an impeccably pressed uniform, entered leisurely, as if taking a stroll. His boots slid softly across the floor, each step measuring the time left until pain. "Do you know why you are here?" His voice was steady, almost polite, but there was something terrifying in that politeness. The prisoner remained silent. The first time, always silent. The interrogator leaned forward, unfastened the file, and looked at the records. "Do you know that your silence only helps us?" The second man in the room, a burly figure with massive shoulders, stood by the wall. He was not there for words. The third stood by the door, watching, noting every movement of the prisoner, even the most insignificant. No one started the torture immediately. That would be too simple. The Gestapo preferred to give hope and then slowly crush it. The interrogator took a glass of water and placed it in front of the prisoner. "Drink. You will need your strength." Some victims agreed, others did not. Those who drank soon realized how cruel this game was. The room was cold, deliberately. The cold made the body shiver, exhausted it faster. The light was blinding, leaving spots before the eyes. The silence squeezed the temples. "Let's talk about your friend." A name. They always started with a name. The prisoner did not respond. The interrogator nodded to his assistant. The first blow was quick and precise, not to the face but to the stomach, so as not to leave marks, but to take the breath away. Again, "Let's talk about your friend." The second blow. This time a fist drove into the side, pain radiating in waves. But this was just the beginning. The Gestapo's torture system was not chaotic. It was constructed with surgical precision. Method 1. Waiting. Sometimes the prisoner was simply left in a dark room for several hours, and then they would return as if nothing had happened. The mind began to work against itself. The imagination painted terrible pictures, and the body weakened without movement. Method 2. Endless interrogation. The same question was asked hundreds of times. An exhausted person might accidentally change a word in their answer, and that was enough. Method 3. Physical exhaustion. They were made to stand for hours until their legs refused to support their body, or they were kept in a cell where it was impossible to sit or lie down. Method 4. Noise torture. Some were subjected to the sounds of other prisoners' screams, creating the illusion that something worse awaited them. Today they chose Method 2. "Where is he? Who do you mean? You know who I mean? Where is he? I don't know. Where is he?" And so on without breaks. At some point, consciousness began to blur. The interrogator closed the file, stood up. "Will you last the night?" "I will. But you?" The door closed. Only darkness remained. The torture had only just begun. Terror never remained within the walls of one building. It spread like a disease, finding new victims in different corners of Europe. In every occupied country, in every city where resistance rose, the Gestapo imposed its laws. And everywhere there were people who were taken away in the night, disappearing without a trace. Belgium, 1942. Gray walls, originally built for defense, now hold prisoners. The dampness that eats away at the lungs, the air thick with fear. Fort Breendonk was turned into a center for torture and interrogation. Every day, new people were brought here. Resistance fighters, Jews, those suspected of disloyalty. The cells had no light. Narrow passages and massive gates created a sense of hopelessness. The prisoners knew, if they were taken to Breendonk, they were unlikely to leave. Interrogation methods. Waiting. The victim was left in complete darkness for several days, breaking their psyche. Cold and water. People were tied to a wall. The cell was no more than a few degrees warm. Sometimes the floor was flooded with icy water. Isolation. Prisoners were kept in solitary cells so small that it was impossible to stand upright. One of the prisoners, Jean Amé, recalled, "There were no screams, only breathing, heavy, ragged. You knew someone was nearby, but you couldn't see them. And then they were taken away, and you never heard them again." Avenue Foch, 84. Un bâtiment magnifique, une fois résidence de l'aristocratie française, maintenant un repère du Gestapo. Inside, dozens of interrogation rooms. Some were used for quick executions, others for long, elaborate tortures. Psychological games were played here. Prisoners were left with a loaded pistol on the table, waiting to see if the person would commit suicide. Sometimes detainees were released into the courtyard for a few minutes, giving false hope of freedom. In some cells, they were forced to listen to recordings of their loved ones' voices, creating the illusion that they had already been arrested. Jean Moulin, the legendary leader of the French resistance, spent several weeks in these halls before his death. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, did not let him die quickly. They knew that breaking someone did not mean killing them. True destruction is when a person can no longer trust even their own thoughts. The Warsaw headquarters of the Gestapo became a symbol of terror in occupied Poland. Here, those who fought for freedom were destroyed. Interrogation methods varied. Abuse of relatives. Mothers were brought bloody children's toys to break their spirits. Endless interrogations, without sleep, food, or water. Mock executions. Prisoners were blindfolded, stood against a wall, a shot rang out, but it was a blank. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 led to a new wave of repression. The Gestapo used its headquarters as a factory of fear, destroying people by the hundreds. One survivor recalled, "They didn't want us to die right away. They wanted us to live in constant fear." When the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia in 1939, they turned the Peček Palace into a torture center. Hundreds of resistance fighters disappeared here. The basements became interrogation cells, the corridors, waiting rooms for death. Methods used here included noise torture. Prisoners were locked in rooms with resonant walls where the screams of victims echoed. Constant lighting. The light was never turned off, turning days and nights into one endless nightmare. Sleep deprivation. People were forced to stand, not allowed to lean against the wall. In this prison, you didn't die right away. You slowly stopped being human. The Gestapo did not just seek enemies of the Reich, it created them. The mere sight of the black Citroën traction Avant cars in which the arrested were transported caused panic among the residents of Paris. In the Netherlands, the Gestapo headquarters was set up in a former school. Classrooms were turned into interrogation rooms. Where children once read letters, people now begged for mercy. In Oslo, the Victoria Terrace building became the headquarters of terror. After the war, it was repurposed, but locals still avoided going there. We thought that if we closed the doors, the memories would disappear. We were wrong. The Gestapo created a system that allowed them to control entire countries through fear alone. People were afraid to speak, and the walls had ears. People were afraid to look each other in the eye. Trust was deadly dangerous. People were afraid to even think, because they didn't know what would betray them first, their tongue or their facial expression. This was a world where terror did not just exist, it became normal. And when fear becomes the norm, a person ceases to be human. The cruelty of the Gestapo was not limited to physical torture. Far more terrifying were the methods that broke the mind, turning a person into a shadow of themselves. Their weapon was not just the whip, but fear, lies, manipulations that left no marks on the body, but burned the soul to ashes. Torture is not just pain, it is a system designed to destroy a person from within. The Gestapo knew that breaking the mind meant killing without killing. In the dark corridors of the Gestapo headquarters, prisoners did not die immediately. They were made to die slowly, every day, every minute. The methods were honed to perfection. Sleep deprivation. The person became vulnerable, lost control over themselves. The boundaries between sleep and reality disappeared. Isolation. Weeks in complete silence, where even the sound of one's own breath seemed deafening. Disorientation. Cells without windows, making it impossible to tell day from night. Playing with hope. Promises of release. Fake letters from family, talks of imminent pardon, only to shatter the illusion at the last moment. But the most terrible weapon was choice. When a prisoner was brought into a room and presented with a dilemma, you talk and we release your brother, or you stay silent and tomorrow he will be here. Many broke, but worse still was that even those who did not break could not shake off the feeling of guilt. You hold on, but at night one question echoes in your head. What if I had talked? Would he still be alive? The Gestapo understood. There is no better way to destroy resistance than to make it consume itself from within. They turned people into traitors. In the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Foch in Paris, a prisoner was kept in a cell for several days, then suddenly released. No torture, no explanations. He returned to his comrades, but now they feared him, suspected him. People didn't know, was he telling the truth or was he released to spy on them? Often no one touched him, But more often, he disappeared after a few days, killed by his own, who could not take the risk. The Gestapo did not need to kill the resistance. It made the resistance kill itself. In Vienna, at the Gestapo headquarters in the Hotel Metropole, there was a case where a prisoner was allowed to escape. 2 weeks later, he led the Gestapo to his underground unit. They didn't know he was working for the enemy. When he was exposed, he repeated only one thing: "I had no choice." They knew I had a daughter. They made prisoners fear their own minds. In the Gestapo headquarters in Prague at Peček Palace, there were cells where nothing was done to the prisoners. They just waited. First, 2 days in solitude. Then screams echoed in the corridor. Someone else couldn't take it. Then the cell door opened. The prisoner was led into an empty room. On the table lay a pistol. An officer sat opposite, silent. After 10 minutes, he said, "You know what to do." Not everyone was made to talk. Some were made to end their own stories. In the Gestapo prison, Kolofu in Hamburg, the cell walls were painted with distorted, chaotic patterns. This was not a random choice. Prisoners lost their sense of space, perspective. Their minds created traps. It seemed that the walls were closing in, that the floor was tilting. One survivor wrote, "I didn't know if I existed. I wasn't sure my memories were real." Psychological terror was no less frightening than physical torture, sometimes even worse. In the headquarters on Aleja Sucha in Warsaw, prisoners were woken every 30 minutes. Within a week, a person lost the ability to think. By the time of the interrogation, they no longer resisted. They simply had no will left. They didn't break me with a whip. They broke me with a spoon they tapped against metal all night. The Gestapo did not always kill. Sometimes it just turned people into empty shells. In Berlin, in the house prison, there was an officer who liked to ask prisoners, "Do you remember who you are? What if I tell you that you never existed?" They played with people's consciousness, erased their personalities, broke everything that made them human, and sometimes prisoners held on, survived. But at what cost? Jeanne May, who survived torture in Fort Brindonk, wrote, "When you are tortured, you know that the pain will pass. But you never forget what you felt. And the most terrible thing is what you were willing to do to stop the pain." The Gestapo knew this. They didn't need to kill everyone. They knew that a person who survived their interrogations would never feel free again. And that's how they won. Not by breaking bodies, by breaking souls. The war was coming to an end. Allied forces were entering cities, driving out the remnants of the Nazi terror machine. They found empty buildings, shattered windows, scattered documents. But the fear did not disappear with the SS soldiers. The Gestapo left behind not just ruins, but wounds in people's consciousness. Now it remained to be seen. Could these wounds be healed? In April 1945, Berlin was quiet. Not because the war had stopped, but because everyone held their breath. Prinz Albrechtstraße 8, das Herz des Gestapos, war noch in Betrieb. But the officers knew the days were numbered. They burned documents, dismantled archives, destroyed evidence. On the last day before fleeing, the commandant of the building gave a strange order: to turn on the music in the main hall. Prisoners being led to interrogation heard a piano, Mozart's Requiem. It was the strangest, most chilling thing I had ever heard. They knew the end was near, but they played as if they wanted to leave one last, painful illusion. Then the executions began. Hasty, chaotic, too many witnesses, too little time. In May, the Allies entered the city. The Gestapo building was already empty, but the horror it left behind remained. Across Europe, the Allies found places that had previously been mere rumors. In Paris, the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Foch was abandoned, but in the basements they found cells with scratched walls. In Belgium, Fort Brindonk stood empty, but there were traces of blood. In Warsaw, the Gestapo headquarters on Aleja Sucha was half destroyed, but the smell of death still hung in the air. The officers who entered first could not believe their eyes. "We knew they tortured people, but we didn't know they turned it into an art." But the real horror began later. They were saved, but no one knew what to do with them next. Survivors did not shout with joy. They were silent. They did not know how to live on. A woman from Prague, who had been through torture in the Peček Palace, could not look at windows for several years. She felt as if someone in a black uniform was standing behind them. A former prisoner of the Kolafu prison in Hamburg confessed that he could not sleep in the dark. He had gotten used to the torture starting then. A French resistance fighter who survived interrogations in Paris said, "I don't know who I am anymore. They left me alive, but they didn't leave me a life." Some survivors chose to leave this world on their own. Others tried to tell the truth, but no one listened to them. The trial began on November 20th, 1945. The Gestapo was declared a criminal organization, but what did that change for the victims? Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Gestapo, sat in the courtroom with an icy face. He claimed he knew nothing. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, fled to Latin America and lived with impunity for decades. Ordinary Gestapo officers, many simply disappeared. Some became intelligence agents for other countries. We thought we would see justice, but instead, we saw one set of criminals judging another. In the 1950s and 1960s, Europe tried to forget. Gestapo headquarters were turned into offices and residential buildings. People did not want to talk about the past. Children did not ask their parents what they did during the war. The Hotel Metropole in Vienna, where thousands were tortured, was simply demolished. The Gestapo prison in Oslo was used as a government building. In Germany, the former Gestapo headquarters in Cologne was a warehouse for a long time. We thought that if we closed these doors, we would close the memory of fear. But some remembered. The psychological scars of Gestapo victims did not disappear. Jean Aimé, a Belgian prisoner, could not bear it. He committed suicide in 1978. Primo Levi, who survived Auschwitz and Gestapo torture, took his own life in 1987. Surviving resistance fighters could not sleep without nightmares, even after 30 years. You leave the cell, but the cell never leaves you. The Gestapo disappeared, but its methods did not. Interrogations without witnesses, mock executions, breaking the psyche through fear and isolation. These techniques became part of repressive systems around the world. Philosopher Hannah Arendt warned, "The banality of evil is that it returns again and again, because it is repeated by those who do not learn from the mistakes of the past." The Gestapo is gone, but their victims live on in memory. In 1987, a museum called Topography of Terror was established at the site of Prince Albrechtstrasse 8. In Paris, a memorial plaque was installed on Avenue Foch. In Warsaw, the headquarters on Aleja Sucha was turned into a museum of struggle. But memory is not just about museums. Memory is about realizing that evil never disappears completely. It waits to return. And if we do not remember, it will return. History that is tried to be forgotten always returns. History that is silenced always repeats itself. The Gestapo is in the past, but its shadow still lies over the modern world. Terror, torture, psychological destruction, tools that have not disappeared but merely changed hands. Prisoners who pass through their cells always ask one question: how could this happen? But the right question is different. How do we prevent it from happening again? The last surviving prisoners of the Gestapo did not remain silent. They understood that their stories were the only weapon against the repetition of horror. Primo Levi, who went through the Nazi torture system, wrote, "Every time someone says, 'This can't happen again,' I remember how many said the same thing before it all began." Elie Wiesel, who survived the concentration camps, warned, "The most terrible enemy of humanity is indifference. It is what allows evil to triumph." But who listened to them? After the war, the world swore, "Never again," but never turned out to be too short. Torture in South American dictatorships in the 1970s, a direct repetition of Gestapo methods. Interrogations in secret prisons in the Middle East, a complete copy of psychological destruction tactics. State terror in totalitarian regimes, the same fear, propaganda, isolation, and destruction of memory. The Gestapo did not disappear. It merely changed form. Many former Gestapo headquarters were demolished, but memory cannot be destroyed by demolishing buildings. In Berlin, at the site of Prince Albrechtstrasse, 8 ruins remained, but every stone there is a witness. In Paris, on Avenue Foch, there is a memorial plaque, small but important. In Cologne, the Gestapo building is now a museum, with inscriptions by prisoners that no one can erase. They remind us, evil always looks ordinary until it is too late. You can destroy walls, you can execute criminals, you can write thousands of books. But as long as people do not remember, history will repeat itself. People say, we would not allow this to happen. But that is what they said in Germany in 1933. People say, we would not remain silent. But the Gestapo thrived not only on sadists, but on the silent majority. People say, that was a long time ago. But as long as there is fear and a lust for power, the tools of the Gestapo will remain relevant. Elie Wiesel said, for the dead and the living, we must bear witness. The history of the Gestapo is a story about power that destroys those who dare to speak. And if the world goes down this path again, it will not be because of evil, but because of indifference. Because as Primo Levi said, it happened, and therefore it can happen again.